Deep beneath the earth, below the heart of Aeonia, in the lightless depths lies the grave of an ancient civilization. It is here Moog, the Lord of Blood, is building his palace to be the seat of his coming dynasty named Mogwin, and whatever nightmares they may bring. Sat atop the pelvis of a long-dead giant is the cocoon of the Empyrean, where the shriveled corpse of Mikola was left behind. This is where we will touch the withered arm and journey to the land of shadow. But how did Mikola end up like this? In part 1, we looked at the history of the lands between and the long-fated Sunrealm, the curious friends Godwyn made after the War of the Ancient Dragons, and came to the conclusion that we may not have all of the information when it comes to what really happened during the Night of the Black Knives. We also were left with an unanswered question. What did Mikola truly want from Godwyn? And how does this tie into Shadow of the Erdtree? To answer that, we need to look at the source of all struggle within the lands between. We need to break down the rules that govern life itself and shatter what you previously thought of Elden Ring. Because only through causality and regression can we find the truth, and thus we can reveal mimicry in all its forms. Hey everybody, Jack here. This script was written and recorded before the release of the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer. So, at the end of this video, there will be an addendum for some additional information that I think is relevant that I kind of thought up after watching that trailer. Without further ado, let's dive in to the Crucible, blood, and everything in between. In an interview with Edge magazine, director Hidetaka Miyazaki explained that the Elden Ring is less of a physical ring and is more of an abstraction, that it represents something metaphysical. Metaphysics being a branch of philosophy that examines the basic structures of reality. So in that sense, the Elden Ring controls the structures of reality. It is the manifestation of the order in which all things within the lands between must abide by. The Elden Ring is comprised of various runes, which, based on their arrangement and presence, dictate what the exact rule set the nature of the world must follow. The most powerful of these runes are the Elden Runes. Only mentioned on the Scar and Sword Seals of Marika and Radagon, these appear to be the foundational rules which govern the world. I surmise there are a total of 3 Elden Runes. The Rune of Life, Marika's Elden Rune, as the eternal Queen Mother who was said to have personally bestowed the sacred blessings of the Erdtree, her rune must be what dictates that things can live. Radagon's Elden Rune, the Lattice, the rune that holds the Elden Ring together, with so many runes from it currently missing, and perhaps the only thing maintaining order in its post-shattered state. And what I suspect to be the last Elden Rune, the Rune of Death, or Destined Death, the rune that dictates that things can die, and for which its removal led to the creation of the Golden Order. With Destined Death removed from the Elden Ring, the concept of natural death has been removed from reality. This is what led to the immortality of the demigods, and this unending life is why we see the mad undead wanderers throughout the lands between. However, there are solutions for this problem. In my previous video, we discussed that before there was an Erdtree, the primary method for the disposal of the dead and the dying was through ghost flame cremation, the process for which bodies and spirits were burned to cinders, the deathbirds being the keepers of these flames. With the flourishing of the Erdtree, a new practice was developed, and this practice would be the center of Erdtree culture and functional society, that of Erdtree burial. In the beginning, everything was in opposition to the Erdtree, but through countless victories and war, it became the embodiment of order. From what we know of Erdtree culture, to them, a proper death means returning a body and spirit to the Erdtree via the Great Tree's massive root system. Found throughout the lands between are statues depicting the Usher of Death, Rhosis, who shows the path to the catacombs through the lands between. The belief was that the dead easily lost their way and were in need of a guiding hand. But more likely than not, the process of Erdtree burial is not a pleasant process at all, for the body or the spirit. And initially, people would have had to been coerced into submitting themselves to this process. Noble and warrior jars were also created, with the dismembered remains of dead soldiers, knights, and gladiators stored in jars for their future use of feeding the Erdtree and its minor Erdtrees. The roots of the Great Tree were once linked to those of the Erdtree, and it is for this reason catacombs were built around Great Tree roots. This process was so sacred and revered that the catacombs and its roots were then protected by autonomous machines. Through the power of glintstone crystals, burial watchdogs and their imps were created and equipped with weapons to crush grave robbers. The imps would wield undulating forked blades that could bleed a corpse dry and feed the roots with their blood. Why would such lengths need to be taken to protect the roots? Who or why would someone want to tamper with them? The roots of a plant are essentially its vascular system. It allows for a plant to absorb nutrients and allows it to grow. And the Erd tree is special. It can produce a blessed sap from its boughs. For a time, those blessings once fell like tears from the Erd tree, and much like the gentle sun, it would gradually heal all who bathed in its rays. So whoever controlled the Erd tree would be able to control this invigorating sap. And when the sap became amber, it was treated as the most precious of jewels in the age of Godfrey, a primordial life energy residing inside. But in order for the Erd tree to produce this amber, and to grow large and imposing, its root system needed to be fed and it needed to be protected. Thus, we can see where conflict would arise. The Erd tree needs to consume bodies and spirits. The Erd tree produces dew and sap that invigorates those who imbibe in it. Whoever controls the Erd tree has a vested interest in continuing the cycle. With this, we can see how a barbarian such as Godfrey would be interested in going to war for the Erd tree and controlling it for himself. But by looking at the banners found throughout the giant conquering hero's grave, it looks like Godfrey may have been persuaded by the Two Fingers to go about this campaign. One notable quality about Godfrey is his primary weapon of choice, an axe. The axe is the man-made enemy of trees, and from the reliefs found in the ancient dynasty, as well as the presence of minor Erd trees, we could make the argument that multiple Erd trees could have existed at some point. A scenario where multiple groups of people had access to root burial and Erd tree sap, allowing for many cultures and regions to share in the same invigorating power, is then easy to envision. A brute like Godfrey, craving power through conquest, could then have the desire to fell the other Erd trees until only one was left, allowing for him and his people to be the only ones to share in that power. Godfrey's campaign was successful due in no small part from the help of his Crucible Knights. One set was led by Ardovus and his men, who all wore the symbolism of an axe on their helmets. The other half led by Siluria, and her men wore the ornamentation of the Great Tree. Siluria's weapon was also modeled after a tree, and its ash of war is named after her woe. Perhaps the Tree Knight felt sadness and shame for the nature with which Godfrey and Ardovus devastated. The many Erd trees chopped down so that only one would remain, and Godfrey could become Elden Lord without fear of competition. But that's all just speculation. The Crucible of Life was the primordial form of the Erd tree, and the red tint of the Crucible Knights exemplified this as the nature of primordial gold, which was said to be close in nature to life itself. The Erd tree must have looked much different during this period than we see it currently. Perhaps it looked like the trees we find in Farum Azula with their Arteria leaves. Dark red leaves with thick swollen veins. A faint pulse can be felt in the veins, and combining it into aromatics can stir the blood and provide an enlivening effect. We also see the blood-red flowers on the back of the Erd tree guardians who are in full bloom. This garb raises the recovery effects of the Flask of Crimson Tears, indicating that they may be part tree already. In George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, the weirwood trees are bone-white trees with blood-red leaves. Faces have been carved into their trunks by the mystical children of the forest, with the belief that their gods lived inside the trees. The weirwood trees are all connected by a vast underground root system, and through this root system, people known as green seers can see through the trees, essentially able to look back in time, with characters like Bloodraven actually intertwined with the roots of the weirwood and doing this constantly. In ancient times, blood sacrifices would be fed to the weirwoods, possibly to invigorate them, and many men of the north would be buried into barrows so that their bodies could be one with the soil that was shared with the root system. In the fandom, there is a concept or theory known as the weirwood net, where the consciousness of skin changers, green seers, children of the forest, and possibly anyone fed to the weirwoods can continue to live on within the trees. A similar practice to Erd tree burial, and much like Erd tree burial, some did not partake. The Starks of Winterfell famously are buried in their underground crypts in stone coffins, much like we can find stone coffins found throughout the lands between. Sometimes, the sap of the weirwoods would collect in the crevices of the carved faces, giving the trees red eyes and making the sap look as if the weirwoods were weeping bloody tears. If left undisturbed, a weirwood tree could live forever. We can see that there are a lot of similarities between George R. R. Martin's two magical trees, and we can attempt to infer what is going on with either the Erd tree or the weirwoods by looking at the other. For example, the children of the forest and the first men believe that their gods live within the weirwoods, and with the location of the Elden Beast America, we can almost confirm that to be true. Likewise, Erd tree burial leads to the soul of the deceased being consumed by the Erd tree, and when some bosses are defeated, their remembrance are hewn into the Erd tree. We could be seeing something similar to the Weirwood Net, where the consciousness or the remembrance of an individual continues to live on in some way within the Erd tree. The color red isn't the only quality of the Crucible and the primordial Erd tree, but it is also where all life was once blended together. We see that through aspect of the Crucible incantations. By harnessing the power of tail, horn, and breath, the caster is able to manifest inhuman physiology. This manifestation echoing the Erd tree's primal vital energies. We don't know exactly what the Crucible is, but the word is defined as a container in which metals or other substances may be melted or subjugated to very high temperatures. Essentially, it is a melting pot to combine metals, but in Elden Ring, it seems to be a melting pot for combining life. In George R. R. Martin's science fiction series Tough Voyaging, which takes place in his Thousand Worlds universe, and for which Hidetaka Miyazaki is a fan of, the titular character Tough comes across something known as a seed ship from the long-defunct Federal Empire's Ecological Engineering Corps. Seed ships were used to rewrite the genetic code of entire planets for genetic and chemical warfare during a period known as the Double War. The Ecological Engineering Corps was known for taking part in such things as cloning, or combining the DNA of humans with other animals to create gross monstrosities such as giant vampire bats, or multi-limbed humanoids. Many of these genetically modified humans would go on to develop their own cultures and civilizations on various planets, unbeknownst to them the history of their creation. Since we know that the Newmen are denizens from another world, and Elden Ring is full of intergalactic beings already, I suspect that the Crucible may be as well. Not that it is exactly the same as a seed ship, but that it is something foreign to the lands between for which its arrival allowed for the growth of the Erd tree and the assimilation of inhuman physiology by humans. With our limited knowledge of what the Crucible is, at this moment I believe it is in this building right here from the Shadow of the Erd tree promotional material. The Godskin Nobles, the most ancient apostles, are said to have assimilated inhuman physiology not unlike the Crucible. And we see this in their serpentine tails and how they can elongate their bodies like snakes. The Misbegotten are also held to be a punishment for making contact with the Crucible, and from birth they are treated as slaves, or worse. So the Crucible is something you can come in contact with. Coming in contact with it can transform your physiology, and the power of the Crucible can be mimicked by other processes. In time, the strength shown by the Knights of the Crucible, and even their appearance, were seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. Where talismans of knot, feather, and scale used to be considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, they are now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced. Our best example to look towards is the Omen, and the origin of their mistreatment. Omens are humans who possess inhuman strength, generally have black or gray skin, grow painful horns from their bodies, as well as fangs and claws. They are also generally born from parents with seemingly no aspects of the Crucible. Morgott and Moog are prime examples of this, with Marika being a Newman and Godfrey being human. Although his close proximity to his Crucible Knights may have affected his reproductive abilities. Omen babies usually have their horns excised, causing most to perish. But Omen babies born of royalty do not have their horns removed. Instead, they are kept underground, unbeknownst to anyone, and imprisoned for eternity. It seems that in current Erd tree culture, there is a fear that if it is known that you bear Omen children, there must be some prevailing belief that there is something wrong with you, or your bloodline, and somehow that makes you incompatible with civilization. We can deduce why that is, and there's a practical reason for it. As established previously, Erd Tree culture is dominated by the practice of Erd Tree burial. It is through Erd Tree burial that the Erd Tree can be fed its necessary diet of bodies and souls, and continue to produce its dew and sap. The Dung Eater would cultivate a tender pox afflicted with omen horns onto corpses in something known as a seedbed curse. By doing so, he prevented dead souls from returning to the Erd Tree, leaving them forever cursed, and leading to those souls to be reborn cursed. They and their children would all share in this curse and would never be able to be given an Erd Tree burial. Though it isn't the horns of the omen that prevent them from returning to the roots, but their blood. Deep underground, Moog stood before the Formless Mother, and his blood erupted with fire, and then he grew to love the defilement that he was born into. His brother Morgott is never mentioned to have met the Formless Mother. In fact, Morgott recanted his accursed blood and sealed it away and reformed it into a blade. Yet still, he is able to perform a cursed blood slice, the bloody trail bursting into flames. We also see that the Omen who are not demigods have the ability to breathe some sort of cursed fire, indicating that it isn't just the demigod Omen who have a fire inside of them. So if the Erd Tree were to consume an Omen, it could potentially destroy the entire root system with their fiery blood. With this, we can deduce the source of Omen persecution and why royal families would hide them in shame. They are essentially beings who are wholly rejected by not only the Erd Tree, but the center of their culture's religion and society. As an aside, we also know that the blood of Albinorics can have harmful effects on those who wish to partake in the Erd Tree's blessings. And with the use of their blood clots, we can craft the Albinoric pot. This item impedes the recovery actions using a Flask of Tears. With this information, then it would stand to reason that the type of blood that is fed into these magical trees and root systems should have predictable effects on them. And it looks like Mikola knew this as well. When Morgott is felled, his Great Rune is transferred from his body to our Tarnished. The curse he was born into, his omen horns and his tail disappear, and he is nothing more than a pockmarked old man. We see a similar sight with Mikola. Instead of the ever-youthful Empyrean, we find a similar pockmarked corpse in giant stature. Based on what happens to Morgott, we can assume that Mikola no longer has his Great Rune on his body. From the Shadow of the Erd Tree promotional material, we learn that the Land of Shadow is a place full of omen and crucible imagery, and that Mikola has divested himself of his flesh, his strength, his lineage, of all things golden. So it seems that Mikola's spirit has been separated from his body, he has cast aside his Great Rune, and the curse of eternal youth is lifted, and somehow he can travel to the Land of Shadow. Unfortunately, we don't have time in this video to go over the mechanics of the Great Runes like I promised in part 1. Hopefully, I'll get to this topic soon. Anyway, when we find the Halig Tree, it is rotted and bent, the city of Elphiel constructed as a brace to assist in keeping it from toppling over. Though watered with Mikola's own blood since it was a sapling, the Halig Tree ultimately failed to grow into an Erd Tree. It failed to continue maturing. Mikola was cursed with eternal youth since birth, and much like his Omen brethren, the effect their curses had on their bodies also has affected their blood. Mikola's ever-youthful blood was not enough for the Halig Tree to fully mature into an Erd Tree. Thus, it failed to do so. But I wouldn't say that the Halig Tree failed in its ultimate goal, to assist Mikola in divesting himself of all things golden, of his flesh, and of his Great Rune, so his spirit could safely travel to the Land of Shadow, teaching him the effects that blood can have on these magical trees. All from his process of bloodletting. Something important to understand about my perspective on Elden Ring is that I think Mikola and Malenia are some of, if not, the oldest demigods in the Lands Between, being most likely born during the Ancient Dynasty. Please consider watching this relatively short video specifically about the curious case of Mikola and Malenia's age here. Being so old and having the appearance of a child leads us to a lot of possibilities for Mikola, to not just accumulate a wealth of knowledge, but also have the advantage of manipulating the other demigods in the entire Lands Between. In part 1, we came to the conclusion that the eclipse is a possible metaphor for the Night of the Black Knives, with Ranni representing the moon and Godwyn representing the sun. With what Mikola learned through the process of watering the Halig Tree with his blood, he can concoct a scheme that would destabilize the Lands Between allowing for all of the pieces to be put in their necessary places and prevent the Erd Tree from consuming souls. Ranni's intervention into the destined death ritual protected both her and Godwyn from dying true deaths, and where Ranni was slayed in her flesh alone, only Godwyn's soul perished. And bore into his flesh was a half-wheel wound of the centipede, the curse mark of destined death, a curse mark of soul death. Godwyn's soul-dead corpse is then buried into the roots of the Erd Tree, and we see that the roots begin to change, and a slick blackness is crawling up towards the world above. This is how the Rune of Death was able to spread across the lands between, through the underground roots of the Great Tree, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. The curse mark afflicted blood of the Prince of Death disallowed souls to be consumed by the Erd Tree, effectively ending the process of Erd Tree burial and bringing the Age of Plenty swiftly to a close. Deathroot was not just the root of death, but it is also the death of the roots, and we see that this was a planned event. In many of the catacombs, we find Deathroot being placed in chests, indicating that they were brought there with a purpose, that sole purpose of infecting and destroying the Great Tree root system, such as places as the Death Touch Catacombs and a Black Knife Assassin placing the Deathroot, the Black Knife Catacombs, where either the Necromancers or the Black Knife Assassin were the culprits, the Gelmir's Hero's Grave, with one of Radagon's red wolves guarding the chest, indicating something very curious about our red-headed champion, and two in the mountaintops, one guarded by an ulcerated tree spirit, and the other on the path towards Miquella's Halig Tree, guarded by a Mimic Tear. Hey, he looks just like me. How strange. With no blessed dew or sap, the Erd Tree became more an object of faith and not a secret weapon for Leyendell or its Elden Lord. Erd Tree burial was still practiced, but it was not effective. Great heroes like the ancient dragon knight Kristoff, the banished knights Oleg and Engval, and knights like Lutel the Headless were all cremated to ash and given Erd Tree burial, but thanks to Deathroot, their ashes and spirits are unable to be absorbed into the Erd Tree, allowing our Tarnished to carry their ash and use Miquella's spirit calling bell to summon ash unreturned to the Erd Tree. With the rise of those who live in death, all criminals, hexers, and Sunrealm soldiers, havoc was being wreaked on the Erd Tree Empire, the previous ruling power's army coming back from the dead for revenge. And the denizens of the lands between can no longer be given death via Erd Tree burial, leading them to go mad in their undeath and wander a wasteland of a world. This destabilization not only leads to the shattering of the Elden Ring and the Shattering War, but the return of the Tarnished and the arrival of our Tarnished. Torrent's chosen Tarnished, and based on the Shadow of the Erd Tree promotional text, Miquella's promised lord. By learning how his own blood affected the Halig Tree, and how Omen blood is rejected by the Erd Tree, Miquella was able to craft a scheme that would bring about the downfall of the Erd Tree, preventing it from absorbing souls, and perhaps protecting him as he traveled to the Land of Shadow. We also see what looks like something akin to Deathroot constricting what is known as the Shadow Tree. Maybe this too was part of Miquella's end goal. By weakening the power of the Erd Tree through Deathroot, access to the Land of Shadow actually became viable. When Mohg abducted Miquella and relocated him to Mogwyn, he attempted to slake his cocoon in his accursed blood. Perhaps that was necessary too, essentially transfusing himself with Crucible-afflicted blood, allowing him to travel to this land that is so clearly touched by the Crucible. Found in the Arise's Hero's Grave is a sword made to commemorate the death of Godwyn the Golden, first of the demigods to die. At the top of the blade is a corpse, crowned by the blazing rays of the sun, in the pose of the Golden Order fundamentalists, infused with the humble prayer of a young boy. "O brother, Lord brother, please die a true death." That prayer is in quotes. It means that this young boy did say those things, but it doesn't say he was telling the truth. Be careful trusting Miquella. The Land of Shadows holds many dark and fearsome creatures, but nothing as frightening as one who wields love to shrive clean the hearts of man. Everybody, thanks for watching to the end of the video. So after watching the story trailer, what was really interesting to me is in the first scene where it looks like the character who is presumably Marika is creating the Golden Order. that there is this division between red and gold. And I noticed that on the Newman runes, they have the same shade of red that you would find in the Crucible armor. The Newman rune also has the same shape and design as like a hero's rune, except the hero's rune is all gold. So it seems that the Crucible probably became something seen as chaotic or scorned after that red was removed from that primordial gold. So red is plucked from like a Newman rune, and now you just have gold grace. It makes it very interesting because now we can see how Marika maybe betrayed a group of people. You know, maybe it was the rest of the Newman. The Newman are kind of a red gold type of people, and she made everything just gold. Another thing that I didn't really talk too much about in this video was the evil spirits that afflict the Omen. There is a great video I watched recently by Zach Magnus called Dualism, Death, Dung, Elden Ring Theory. And I think that video does a pretty good job of covering maybe how spirits interact with the Omen and the Crucible. Spirits and corporeal flesh are both very important within Elden Ring. So perhaps when the red is removed and now you have gold and then Crucible red separate, people who are crucibly afflicted, the evil spirits do something with, their blood or whatever. I couldn't say for certain, but it seems that there's a connection there. I also just wanted to explain briefly why this video is important. What I tried to do was deduce what the mechanics of blood are and how they affect these special trees. Because if there is a consistent rule set for things like what type of blood you feed a potential Erd tree, then that means not only will we know it, but characters in the universe will know it. So if a character within the Lands Between knows that if you give a tree a certain type of blood, something will happen, then they can start doing things so they can get that blood and they can feed it to the tree. That's where we get Mikola using his eternally youthful blood to water the Halig tree, and then potentially learns how different types of blood affect different types of trees, and then concocts a scheme to get this curse mark infected blood to create Deathroot to potentially protect his spirit while going to the Land of Shadow, maybe to weaken the Erd tree, maybe to do some destabilization. But, there has to be some connection there to how blood works and why certain events happen within the game. So, hope you enjoyed that video. I have a few other videos, if you haven't watched them previously, they showed them on screen. Next week, I think, is going to be the Great Rune video, and we're going to talk about the mechanics of the Great Runes, and then hopefully, before the DLC, I will have a video on Melina, as well as a video on how we can predict who an Empyrean will be. So, if you like my content, please subscribe. There's also a Discord. That's about it. All right. Thank you very much.